Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're delighted to bring this trauma-informed leadership webinar to you, featuring Dr. Dan Guerra. Dr. Guerra is a clinical psychologist with 25 plus years experience treating individuals and groups and an executive coach with a private practice in New York City. He has traveled in the USA and abroad, giving talks on topics including leadership development, stress management in the workplace, evidence-based relaxation strategies, social emotional learning, and the role of body, mind, brain learning in healing trauma. He has co-authored the book From Stress to Centered, A Practical Guide to a Happier and Healthier You. Dr. Guerra studies and implements recent findings in neuroscience to support and enhance his personal and professional experiences in the areas of Eastern wisdom and the healing arts to deliver a psychology of health and wellness to his patients and clients. He is also an avid world traveler who has been fortunate enough to visit over 40 countries and to hike many mountain ranges across the globe. He is delighted, of course, to be here with all of you today. And I want to thank Dr. Guerra for being here and pass it over to him.
Thank you, Dr. Ryan. And I'd like to also thank Lynn Allen and Jackie Levine for partnering with me for these workshops and webinars. And Jackie, once again, thank you for the introduction. So again, my name is Dan Guerra. I'm a psychologist and executive coach, and I give talks on trauma and social emotional learning. A good portion of my private practice in Manhattan is dedicated to working with folks who have had trauma in one form or another. I'm also a survivor of childhood trauma myself, so I draw both on professional and personal experiences related to this topic and when I work with people in these areas. So I just want to start by saying and stating the obvious, which is that clearly we're living in very, very stressful times, as if it weren't the case even before COVID-19. But it's worth mentioning that this particular week, with all that's going on across the nation, plus pandemic, and more specifically, all that you guys are dealing with as educators and administrators, I just want to acknowledge the large elephant in the Zoom room and just acknowledge all of you for coming together here for this talk. These are the moments that are, I think, beacons of light in a sea of uncertainty, and I'm just grateful and very happy and honored to be here together with all of you. So yesterday, I had a patient say this: the world is absolutely upside down and crazy, and I feel unsafe. I think what we'll find is that safety is really the hallmark, or feeling unsafe, when we begin to talk about trauma. We'll see a little bit more of that in a few moments. But one of the silver linings, if there is a silver lining with all that we're dealing with, particularly with trauma and trauma-informed leadership, is that we'll find that the direction that we need to go in, despite the cause of the trauma, whether it's a tsunami or a school shooting or bullying or a pandemic, all horrible, horrific things. But the direction that we need to go in is basically the same. So our response can be fairly simple, maybe not easy, but it's a simple path to point to, despite what it is that we're dealing with. I like to simplify things and try as best we can without being overly reductionistic to provide a path that we can all kind of relate to and move toward. So through the talk, we'll have sections where I'll pause for questions, and I'll also ask some questions for you to participate, and you can type your responses in the chat box, and Jackie's been kind enough to moderate that for us. Okay. So in all transparency, you'll see that today my approach to delivering the talk will model and parallel how leadership can play a prominent role in the face of trauma. I invite all of you, if you will, just to implement some boundaries for yourself, shut off notifications, and prevent yourself from checking emails and texts if at all possible. This kind of intention and attention and this kind of focus will set us up nicely for deeply understanding what's needed at this time for trauma-informed leadership. A lot of it has to do with having an impact on our brains. So that's my invitation to you. So now purposes. The purposes for today, we're going to start with operationalizing trauma, trying to get our arms around what this concept is and get some definitions. I'd like to do a deeper awareness of how trauma shows up so we can relate to it in our personal and professional lives. Then I'm going to offer you two approaches that begin to head us down a path to addressing and responding to trauma when we see it and when it's happening, particularly in your case, in schools and in the education system. And then, of course, as I'm known for doing at the end, we'll do a brief practice. This is where the rubber meets the road, so we can get it into our bodies and minds, part of this approach and pathway to respond. Okay, so as we try to operationalize trauma, we see that it's hard to pin down due to its complexity, but certainly trauma requires a mind, body, and brain response. There's a feeling of overwhelm and an experience of just being flooded with feelings. We lose our ability or impaired ability to cope with stress and stressors that are coming at us. There's an increased sense of helplessness, a compromised sense of self, so who we are in the world and how we're relating to others. And then also we have an impairment in expressing our full range of feelings and experiences. There's a need to sort of anesthetize or build walls around our full range of feelings. So trauma is a psychological and emotional response to an event or an experience that's deeply distressing or disturbing. And that can run the gamut from something as seemingly benign as being involved in a car accident or having an illness or injury, losing a loved one, or even going through a divorce, either as an adult or a child. And I say seemingly benign because those things are certainly impactful and they're difficult experiences, but we may not necessarily correlate those with traumatic experiences. Well, they certainly can be traumatic. So it can run the gamut from that end of the spectrum all the way to encompassing extreme and very, very painful experiences, including rape and torture or significant neglect or ongoing abuse. Some useful distinctions in the field of trauma are simple traumas, complex traumas, and developmental traumas. So a simple trauma is basically having one particular incident happen. That would be, for example, let's say a significant car accident. Complex trauma is repetitive trauma with cumulative effects. So that would be multiple traumas, at different time periods. Developmental trauma happens usually in the first 4 years of life, and this is often due to neglect, abandonment, or some type of abuse. And this developmental trauma will disrupt the child's psychological, cognitive, or social development because it interferes with early attachment. You can look at this as getting in the way of a person's social and emotional needs. So school-age children do not have to be in a car accident or lose a limb, God forbid, or have a trauma that is, readily visible in order to be effective. Developmental traumas often begin with some adverse childhood experience and work in ways that challenge secure attachment. This has short-term and long-term impacts. So even in non-COVID times, we need trauma-informed approaches and social emotional learning to prevent trauma, to heal trauma, and to support resilience and well-being. So you might have all heard of a syndrome related to trauma, which is post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. This is an anxiety disorder that develops as a result of exposure to one or more traumas. And with this disorder, we have frequent and distressing thoughts and memories of the event. And it's usually accompanied by uncontrollable feelings like rage, or distress. So some of these nuances of trauma may be easy to miss unless one is properly trained and informed. So hopefully that's a good sense of getting our arms around the complexities of it. Now, other aspects of trauma also very worth mentioning is that trauma is unbearable and intolerable. It takes a tremendous amount of energy to keep functioning while carrying a traumatic memory. And the longer we live, the more likely we are to experience some form of trauma, even if that trauma happens vicariously when we witness somebody going through a horrific experience. And we can imagine all of the trauma that's unfortunately happening right now, even vicariously through the news, through observing our friends and family who are dealing with terrible experiences or going through them directly ourselves. Okay. So this image here really captures the heart of what people are dealing with trauma. It's really about, as I mentioned earlier, safety. There's a threat, first, to our physical safety, bodily harm, emotional safety, how secure we're feeling on the inside with our feelings and emotions. And then there's a threat to our thinking as well. Oftentimes with trauma, we'll see catastrophic thinking, fear-based thoughts, negative appraisals of situations that are going on that may or may not be proportional to the experience that we're having. And of course, with the arrows going both ways, all of these interact with one another. It's really about safety. And when we begin to approach a pathway to healing trauma, we have to address the person's sense of physical, emotional, and cognitive safety. So this is a study on adverse childhood experiences. You heard me mention that a moment ago, or the ACE study, you might have heard of it. The original ACE study was conducted at Kaiser Permanente, and along with the CDC from 1995 to 1997. And there were two waves of data collection. Over 17,000 HMO members from Southern California participated in the study, and it covered an age group from 19 on up. So an adverse childhood experience could include one or more of the following: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, which could be a number of things, or living in a home that has an incarcerated relative. These are some of the examples. So as we see on the slide here, on this chart, we see that as the number of ACEs increases, the risk for negative health and well-being outcomes also increases. And by negative health and well-being outcomes, we're talking about our physical health. So diabetes and obesity and depression is on the rise. Destructive behaviors like drug and alcohol abuse, smoking, or could be even raging and aggression. And something that I know is all close to your hearts, which is life potential. So academic achievement, graduation rates, and just our general sense of success and accomplishments in life. So as ACEs increase, unfortunately, even premature death increases and risk for suicide as well. So this study really points to a number of things. There is one study in your resource list that found that resilience has an important relationship to ACE outcomes. So building resilience, which is defined in the survey as staying calm and in control when faced with a challenge. So for children between the ages of 6 and 17, building resilience can ameliorate the negative impact of adverse childhood experiences. I think this is very hopeful, so that if we can build resilience inside our classrooms and in the school community, we may be impacting, we likely will be impacting positively the impact of these adverse childhood experiences on trauma. This points to the importance of leaders supporting the school age cohort now to develop the insights and skills to overcome these experiences and develop things like self-knowledge, social and emotional skills, and all of that will grow resilience going forward, which will ensure better well-being. Now, there are many specific COVID-related ACEs that are happening right now, I'm sure. Things like the anxiety for parents around managing home life and work life, and virtual classrooms, which is in this stage just new to everybody. We're hearing some reports of increase in domestic violence. Substance abuse is increasing in these times of stress. And unfortunately, we're expecting suicidality and suicides to be on the rise. And we only need to look at what's happening in the news in this last week to see all of this played out, what's in the hearts and minds of so many as stress and uncertainty and injustices ratchet up. So that's mostly on the mental health side of things, which of course is intimately related to education and I'm sure, important to all of you. But let's take a look at what else we might be facing here in addition to that. So I was just thinking about what you all might be dealing with on your end as we, get further into this pandemic and responses to it, virtual classrooms. I'm thinking there must be plenty of layoffs. I know that there's budget concerns. We're all dealing with these virtual classrooms and Zoom rooms and how that impacts education, or is it as effective? Certainly the physical health of your students and staff and the mental health, and also information overload, just everything coming in. What do we pay attention to? What do we ignore? We only have a certain time period to deal with this. And even though, we've saved on some time from commuting perhaps, and we're at home, there's still limits on that. And then the question, when and if do we return? So those are some of the things that I've been hearing from my educator friends and just thinking about it. But I'd like to hear now what you're facing. So in this uncertain world, what is it that you're facing? Any additions or elaborations or any comments? And Jackie will take those in the chat boxes. Okay, thank you for that contribution. I'd like to now just briefly go through the 5 pillars of emotional intelligence, also very much related to trauma-informed leadership. This concept of emotional intelligence was really packaged and put forward by Daniel Goleman in 1995 with his book on EI. And you might be familiar with some of these pillars. I know that Mark Brackett and Scott Levy delivered an excellent talk recently on emotional intelligence in this time of COVID, and I imagine many of you caught that. It was very good. So the first pillar of emotional intelligence, fairly self-explanatory, is self-awareness. So we focus on behaviors and observations that bring information to better understand the self. This involves a tuning in or bringing our focus from an purely external view to one that goes inside through a reflective process. The second pillar is self-regulation. So once we understand what's happening internally, can we modulate it, regulate it, have our finger on the dial button to dial our experiences up, down, or to the middle with the purpose of having better outcomes. A third pillar is motivation, very much related to emotionally intelligent leaders. So motivation is that which drives us that goes beyond external reward, things like salary, prestige, or title. So it's that achievement just for the sake of achievement and coming from internal factors, an internal drive. Fourth pillar is empathy, also a slightly misunderstood concept sometimes. When want to be careful not to confuse empathy with sympathy, which is really, along the lines, goes down the path of either pity or even aggression in some ways when we take that too far. So empathy is that old adage of walking in the shoes of another person, but it also involves a sense of feeling with another person. So even if you don't directly relate to or have experienced what another person goes through, empathy is that skill that is able to take something inside of me and relate it to something inside of you. So while I personally, as an example, may never have experienced the sort of vitriol of racism, for instance, I may be able to reach inside of me to notice that what it feels like to feel rejected or to be treated unfairly or to feel rage and anger from being mistreated. And I can connect that to another person. So this is where empathy lives. There's also positive empathy, which isn't often talked about, which is that part of us that can take joy and celebrate the positive things that are going on in another person's life. Very important for emotional intelligence. And lastly is social skills. And social skills does not only comprise ability to sort of tell jokes at the water cooler kind of thing or socialize well, but it's also being able to pick up on social cues in a social setting and to sort of sense inherently what's needed for good communication and healthy relationships. Okay, so, trauma-informed leadership is emotionally intelligent leadership. And what I'm emphasizing in today's talk here, and for the remainder of this talk, as I said, I'd like to bring it in and simplify if we can, is really self-regulation. That's the pillar that I think we have the most bite to in dealing with trauma. Self-regulation, in my opinion, is really where the rubber meets the road. This is what drives resilience and helps us deal with whatever comes down that river. Okay, so as the old saying goes, sometimes less is more. And in this case, I believe focusing on this as a strong point of trauma-informed leadership can lead us down a strong path. So emotionally intelligent leadership involves the ability to know what I'm feeling, to read what you're feeling, and to use this information to make good decisions and to reach our goals. Okay, what's happening in the brain with all of this? So here we have a slide of your brain. Remember those old commercials from the 1980s? This is your brain on drugs. Any questions with that fried egg? Well, this is much lighter. This is your brain on a flip chart or a PowerPoint slide. So let's take a quick look at this. If you're like me, you like brains and neurobiology. I love talking about this stuff. So as we see in the middle, we have this little almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. And let's look and see how stress and trauma operate here in the brain. We can lead us into the approaches on how to deal with it. The amygdala is the smoke detector of the brain. It's saying, is there a fire? Am I safe? Activate. So this is where stress lives and is responded to one way or another. It's not exactly where it originates or begins, that's in the reptilian brain, but it certainly is that response that we become familiar with: fight, back, escape, or shut down. This is what's happening right there in the midbrain. Now, the medial prefrontal cortex or the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, we could just call it the prefrontal cortex. Here, this is the watchtower. This is the view from above, our frontal lobes, right? Our higher cognition, where rationality sits. It might ask the question, is the house actually on fire, or is that smell coming from the barbecue? I do remember that we lit the barbecue, so before I go into panic mode, let me check it out. Right? This watchtower also tells us about how other people's responses are so that we can assess our safety. Is this person coming at me with aggression right now? Is that what I'm reading on their face? Or maybe they're just thinking about something and look concerned. This happens in nanoseconds. We develop, hopefully, this skill over time. But it's also strengthened through emotionally intelligent practices. So a good watchtower will be able to distinguish when what we see from others is really about them and not us. And also, a good prefrontal cortex is crucial for preserving and developing good relationships with all of our fellow humans. In trauma, the relationship between the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala, it breaks down and it becomes much more difficult to control our emotions and our responses. Now, the reptilian brain, this is where the autonomic nervous system really lives. It originates right in the brainstem. This is instinct, that fight or flight or freeze really begins here. So trauma-informed leadership here is emotionally intelligent leadership. I'd like for a moment just to acknowledge some of the things that I've been hearing from my discussions, both with Jackie and Lynn. So I know a lot of this is already happening. Things like finding Zoom platforms to have formal meetings, to instruct and direct and let your staff know that you're thinking of them. Informal class drop-ins, giving students and teachers that foundational support that they need. I've even heard that maybe one or more of you are actually reading stories to students. This is fantastic. I'm aware of mindfulness rooms that have been created, made available to your students and in schools. So seems like there's a pivot, perhaps, at least right now, hopefully ongoing, from a mostly day-to-day operational standpoint to where you're really sitting with the reality of what's happening with staff and students. Bravo, incredible. Many of you out there and interested in a talk like this. So you're doing emotionally intelligent work that's necessary for this trauma-informed leadership. And maybe now it's just about how to refine, how to become more artful or more expert at it, and to maximize the timing of it all, which can be tricky. So inviting, promoting, and modeling self-leadership comes through a lot of these practices. Have something to read to you, which is that chronic stress happens when the brain feels like things are unpredictable, uncontrollable, and it's going to stay that way. Unpredictable, uncontrollable, and staying that way. Self-awareness, self-regulation, and self-management begin to address that chronic stress and also impact our interactions and relationships with others by promoting healthier social responses, greater emotional resilience, back to resilience, and deeper empathic understanding. So we're going to talk about approaches to self-regulation. Before we do, I think this is always the most important slide because it shifts our attention away from that daunting, unanswerable question of what's the solution? How do we fix this? And brings us to the simple but profound truth of knowing that if I can somehow embody and practice self-regulation myself and have that direct experience, which is really our best teacher, I think many would agree, then I can start to impart and lead and guide others to have that experience and the ball gets rolling in the right direction. So it has to start with us. How do we move forward? Reestablishing safety through self-regulation. I'm offering two approaches, top down and bottom up. These approaches relate to this brain slide because top-down approaches are going from that higher order cognition and frontal lobes to the amygdala. Bottom up is dealing with the more instinctual aspects and going up from the reptilian brain to the amygdala, okay? Those are the two approaches. And there's the brain for you, just so you can get a visual of what that looks like. But it's all in service of that pesky little almond-shaped structure there, the amygdala. Top-down regulation involves beginning to get granular and specific about how to address emotions and edify relationships and thoughts and actions in a way that regulate our stressed out brains. We can monitor body sensations as an example. This is just turning our attention inward and using our language to name what's happening in the body. Heart rate increases, butterfly in the stomach, tension in the shoulders. That brings our brain online, just that acknowledgement. Paying attention to our thoughts and actions. So things like positive self-talk, talking to the self that was traumatized, or it doesn't have to be trauma, even just talking to the self that's stressed. I often have my patients put their hands right here on their heart center and on their belly. Can't see my belly right now, but on the navel. And just, as odd as it seems, just speak to the part that feels overwhelmed. What's the matter, you know? Things are gonna be okay, or I'm here for you. Be surprised. A lot of people come back shaking their heads, say, I don't know what that crazy voodoo doc that you're telling me to do, but it really works. There's something that calms my nervous system when it happens. There's a reason for that, because that traumatized part is still operating in us, and it's not connected to our higher cognition. Mental health counseling, we need learning what you can control and what you can't. Just that identification is helpful. Empathy and self-forgiveness. And something that's not talked about too often, which is positive empathy. That is actually actively taking joy with somebody else in their successes and their joys. So a positive empathy is actually working on feeling the good feelings that somebody else is having. Clear and transparent communication. I probably don't need to tell all of you how important that is in helping others feel safe, involving others in decisions, and certainly just the mere presence of a caring adult, research has shown, is very helpful with top-down regulation. Let me just say a word on vulnerability while we're here. And I wish I could take credit for this, but this comes from Brene Brown's work, which I know a lot of you have studied and you've read Dare to Lead. But vulnerability, and we know that courage is contagious, but so is fear. So if we think of a time where courage existed, we'd be hard pressed to not think of these three things, which is uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. And this is what we're up against right now, and even pre-COVID, I think. And those three things, risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure, they comprise vulnerability. But there's connection that occurs when we become skillful at sharing vulnerability. Hopefully I've modeled a little bit of that today. I certainly felt vulnerable at certain times during our presentation today. It's not just for the purpose of the presentation, but I challenge myself and try to grow as a presenter in joining with you in that human experience. You may not be able to relate to the exact thing that happened to me, but everybody can relate to having certain feelings, feeling anxious, feeling a deep sadness, feeling a helplessness. And that realm is very powerful. Okay. Don't have to spend too much time on bottom-up regulation, but I'll just say in this phase, we're recalibrating the autonomic nervous system. And we're dealing with things like breath and movement and touch. In school settings, I have many ideas how this can be implemented, particularly the Yoga Nidra, which if you don't know, I recommend you look that up. It's a very powerful practice that just involves lying on the floor and listening to a protocol. But breath is literally right under our nose, can take 3 to 5 minutes to affect a change. Movement, things like Tai Chi, mirroring, and certainly exercise. Touch I was thinking about, which I know could be a sensitive topic in a school setting, but even self-touch has been shown, self-massage has been shown to have healing effects and soothing effects on the brain. EMDR, I'll just briefly mention, is a therapy that's evolved, very popular and worthwhile in trauma, that involves eye movements. You follow the facilitator or therapist's hand moving back and forth. And this has a incredibly helpful reprocessing effect on the brain. EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing. Okay, I'm just moving on to this integrative slide here, which comes from Castle. I know all of you are probably familiar. It's just my only thing here is to emphasize again that these approaches need to be integrated school-wide in order to be effective. With all due respect, and I'm impressed with the mindfulness rooms, if they just stay as a room for children to go to or staff to go to when they're needing sort of a break, not as robust necessarily as having integrated mindful curricula being spread out throughout the school-wide on all levels, everybody on the same page, so we can begin to change the culture of self-regulation. One example of an integrative mindfulness curricula is this here. I gave you the YouTube link. I really recommend you check it out, where mindfulness is integrated school-wide and observed a change in the need and type of discipline when it was implemented. And in addition to marked change in school culture, the children themselves have begun to lead themselves in meditation, and thereby taking ownership of their own regulation. Here's a quote from one of the teenage participants named Latoya, who said, "My day is so stressful. As soon as I walk in the door, there's this big smile on my face, even before the mindfulness exercises. Without this, I wouldn't even be here." So the interviewer says, "Why?" He says, "Because it's too stressful out there, and not having a place to relieve stress is like putting you in an oven." That really hit me. And one teacher I've heard from personally gave the examples of stories of bullying and self-harm and feelings of alienation of students within schools, and just a lack of awareness of who to turn to or how to deal with it. So this is one success story in that area. Okay, I think with the time left, I'd like to shift to practice, where that rubber meets the road. Before I do, I'll just say that mindfulness and mindful approaches to stress management, to learning, to resilience are really the sine qua non right now of where we need to be with self-regulation, in my opinion. The research is there, the practices are there, the applications are there. And I think Jackie has agreed to send out a nice article by Joshua Ehrlich, who studied at NYU and Yale and put out lots of great material on outcome-based research and mindfulness in leadership. So I recommend you look that over. But for now, I'd like to shift a little bit, and with the time we have left, just ask you to reflect, mindful reflection, top down, to see how is it that I'm feeling at the moment. Try to find a word or phrase. You don't have to share it just yet or type it in. Just register it to yourself. And I'd like to invite all of you to participate in this practice, a bottom-up approach, which is ratio breathing. I'll take you with it. Just remember how you're feeling, however it is, non-judgment, could be positive, negative, anywhere in between. And for the moment, I'd just like you to sit comfortably in your chair, hands in your lap, feet on the ground, uncrossed. And if you feel comfortable with it, up to you. You can allow your eyes to close and just listen to the instructions. But if you keep your eyes open, just engage in a soft gaze on a spot, either on your table or the floor, and just become aware for a moment of the fact that you're breathing. Also become aware of any tendencies to want to keep being distracted or check or using your your thinking brain too much, any resistance to practicing or shifting gears. And without any judgment, you just let that be part of your experience. So without manipulating your breath or changing it in any way, just notice that the breath comes in and the breath goes out. Just a never-ending cycle and flow. Good. Not doing anything with that, just noticing. And now, in a moment or two, I'd like you to begin counting your inhaled breath. I'd like you to count to a count of 4 for your inhale. And then when you reach the top of 4, hold for a count of 2. And then exhale to a count of 6 or 7. 6 or 7. This will require you to time your breath a little bit, but don't worry or stress about it. Just allow the count to be as quick or as slow as you need to inhale to a count of 4, hold for a count of 2, and exhale to a count of 6 or 7. Breath's coming through the nose. Just notice that. Just allow yourself to feel it and to follow it. Stay with it. Stay with it. Very good. Stay with it. Great. I'd like to add that you can always exhale a little longer than you think. So let's take the exhale now from 6 to 7 to 7 or 8. Inhaling to a count of 4, holding for a count of 2, and exhaling to a count of 8, 7 or 8. No stress, no achievement, no judgment. Letting all of that be aside, just a simple enjoyment of the practice. Very good. Stay with it. Doing well. Good. Good. On the next full ratio, so once you exhale fully, you can begin to stop the practice and just allow your eyes to open when you're finished. And as you allow your eyes to open, do another check-in with yourself briefly, just to say, how is it that I'm feeling at the moment? Just like we did before the practice. Might have stayed the same, might have gotten worse or better, not important. Just notice how you're feeling. And if you would, if a few folks wouldn't mind typing that in the chat box, and Jackie can, just read the responses if you're comfortable with that. You don't have to, of course. And then we can leave a little bit more room for any questions or comments. Anyone have any response to how they're feeling after that practice?
One of our participants said, "Thank you, much better." And Lynn, she feels more relaxed and we also have feeling relaxed, more feeling relaxed.
Relaxed, feeling better, happy, okay.
Self-aware.
Self-aware. Good. Anyone feeling worse, anxious, tense?
Centered.
Centered. We usually get one or two say, this counting, it got me nervous, or very common. If you're a type A plus like me, when I first did this, I wanted to do it perfectly, as if there's some perfect way to count, 4, 2, and 8. It takes a while to undo that. Anything else, Jackie?
Calm. We had a comment of calm.
Calm. Good. Very good. So just noticing how just a small shift and pivot in our awareness and our attention can create a different experience. This is a bottom-up approach using breath. And it makes me wonder, it makes me think, how can this be integrated regularly? If we know that our focus improves, our attention improves, our sense of well-being, my connection to you. Just in this practice, I always feel more connected to the participants because we're sharing, we're getting into it. If all of that can improve, how can these things be rolled out? What creative ways can we find to make this a regular part of our school system, our learning, so that children can have something to go to, that they can know that they're carrying this around with them? It's very impactful for me. It's very moving to me. I think this is just one of many, many, many bottom-up approaches. So thank you for participating with that. And I'll have to, at this stage, just say thank you very much, all of you, for just being here today. And I'm going to pass things back over to Lynn and just end with this slide here.
I think we have time for a little Q&A.
Good.
There was a question, Dr. Guerra, earlier from one of our participants, and I'm just going to scroll back to it, that if ACE is a factor in childhood development, how do we approach incoming kindergartners who we are not familiar with at present? So we don't have that relationship built with them. And Frank, if you'd like to unmute yourself to say more about your question, feel free. This is a great time for anybody in our room to unmute yourself and ask a question or a comment, and also put it into the chat.
My question is around collective trauma, where we have a large group of children coming our way with this shared traumatic experience. It's not an isolated trauma where we have a car accident or these other issues. And we don't have the relationships built with these students like we do with current K through 12th graders.
Yes.
And is there an approach or recommendation in looking at how we bring in our children and transition them as new kindergartners when they've had this shared collective trauma?
Yes, great question, Frank. Thank you for that. And I don't know if you were on the line a little earlier. So one of the silver linings, I think, to all of this is that we can simplify it to say that the approach or response is the same. And I think the good news, I'm always looking for good news, is that whether or not a child is coming in with adverse childhood experiences, you're basically saying, how do we do this blind, but also kind of knowing that we're all having this shared collective experience? I think the approach and response is the same. Regulate, teach self-regulation. Because for the child who's not dealing with an adverse childhood experience, they're going to go from good to better or well-being and learn a valuable skill. And the child that is traumatized and going through something, they're going to learn how to establish safety within themselves. I think I have your question. If I didn't, please let me know.
No, that's correct. We had an approach to use our emotional regulation strategies, but we didn't know if we needed something different.
I don't think so. I really don't. Everything that I've learned, everything that I'm reading, and that I like to try to make less is more, just to kind of grab onto one thing. If this can be just done K through 12 and beyond, I think we won't have hurt anything and have helped a lot. And the worst case scenario is, I think a child walks away not having adverse child experiences, but feeling better, feeling more relaxed, having a tool to use for better learning, for self-soothing, for getting even better.
Well, as a ruler school, that's very reassuring. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Guerra. And I'm going to pass it to Lynn to help us wrap up for the day. But I want to thank you so much for all of your expertise and all that you've shared with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you for moderating.
Yes, and I'll just echo the gratitude to Dr. Guerra. You certainly did not disappoint. We were looking for an overview of trauma-informed leadership, and that you did give us. We very much appreciate all of the time that you took preparing, being here today, and we certainly will look forward to our continued work and partnership together. I also want to say thank you to Jackie for her most excellent facilitation, and last but not least, all of you who joined us late in the day. I very much appreciate your commitment to this important topic. And we hope that we will be able to continue to revisit this trauma-informed leadership. And one of the participants put in the chat that it starts with ourselves. And hopefully we've taken the first step to do that today and to do that together. We also want you to know that we here at PNW BOCES remain here for all of you in whatever it is that you should need. We'd appreciate your feedback on this session and or if there are any other follow-up items that we can help to coordinate, that would be our great privilege and pleasure. And once again, we hope that you all stay safe and well. We hope that you take good care. As Dan put on his last slide, we say goodbye for now and until we meet again. Have a good afternoon, everyone. See you soon.